What would you do if you came home from serving your country, only to discover that the people you trusted most were plotting to profit from your father's death? My name is Nia, and I'm about to tell you a story that will make your blood boil and your heart race. It's a story about betrayal so deep it cut through family bonds like a knife through paper. It's about greed so consuming that it turned a mother against her stepchild, siblings against each other, and love into a weapon of destruction. But most importantly, it's about justice. Sweet, calculated, military precision justice that turned the tables so completely, my enemies didn't know what hit them until it was far too late. If you're ready for a story that proves sometimes the best revenge is served ice cold and legally bulletproof, then buckle up. But first, hit that subscribe button, because you're about to witness the most satisfying takedown you've ever heard, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Let me paint you a picture of who I was before this all began. Staff Sergeant Nia Mitchell, United States Army, 27 years old, with 3 tours of duty under my belt and a spine made of steel. I'd seen combat in places most people can't even pronounce, made life-or-death decisions in split seconds, and earned the respect of every soldier I served alongside. But here's the thing about being a soldier: you learn to read people. You develop an instinct for danger, for deception, for when something just isn't right. You learn to trust your gut because your gut keeps you alive. And you learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones shooting at you from across a battlefield. Sometimes they're the ones sitting at your dinner table, smiling to your face while sharpening knives behind their backs. I came from a complicated family. My mother died when I was 12, and my father James remarried a woman named Laura when I was 15. Laura brought 2 children from her previous marriage, Jake, who was my age, and Tina, 2 years younger. On the surface, we looked like the perfect blended family. Dad was a successful businessman who'd built a small empire in construction and real estate. Laura was the devoted stepmother, always organizing family dinners and holiday gatherings. Jake and Tina were my new siblings, or so I thought. But even as a teenager, something felt off. The way Laura's eyes would harden when Dad wasn't looking. How Jake and Tina would whisper and stop talking when I entered a room. The subtle comments about how I was James's real daughter while they were just stepchildren. I chalked it up to normal blended family growing pains and threw myself into school, then into military service. The Army became my real family. My brothers and sisters in arms understood loyalty, sacrifice, and honor. We had each other's backs, no questions asked. We bled together, fought together, and would die for each other without hesitation. It was everything I thought a family should be. But blood, they say, is thicker than water. What they don't tell you is that sometimes blood can be poisoned from within. After 6 years of service, I was coming home. Not for good. I was on a month's leave before my next assignment, but long enough to reconnect with family and figure out my next steps. As I drove through the familiar streets of Millbrook, population 15,000, I felt that bittersweet mix of nostalgia and pride that every veteran knows. The same gas station where I'd bought candy as a kid. The high school where I'd played volleyball and dreamed of adventure. The park where Dad had taught me to throw a baseball. Everything looked smaller somehow, the way childhood places always do when you return as an adult. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The town felt diminished. Several shops were boarded up, the local diner had a for sale sign, and there were more potholes in the roads than I remembered. When I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, Laura was waiting on the porch with Jake and Tina. The house looked immaculate as always. Laura had always been obsessive about appearances, but the 3 of them seemed different. Older, obviously, but there was something in their posture, in the way they looked at me, that set off every alarm bell I'd developed over 6 years of military service. Laura rushed down to greet me with arms wide and a smile so bright it could have powered the house. "Nia, oh my God, look at you. You look so strong, so official in that uniform." She hugged me tight, but I felt the tension in her shoulders. the way she held me just a beat too long, as if she were performing for an audience. Jake gave me an awkward handshake. When had my stepbrother become so formal? And Tina managed a quick hug before stepping back like I might contaminate her. "Where's Dad?" I asked, looking around. It was unlike him not to be the first one greeting me. James Mitchell had never missed a homecoming, not from summer camp, not from college, not from any of my previous military leaves. The three of them exchanged a look that lasted maybe 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds, I saw volumes. It was the kind of look people share when they know something you don't, when they're deciding how much truth to reveal. "Oh, honey," Laura said, her voice dropping to that patronizing tone I remembered from my teenage years. "Your father is. Well, he's not doing so well. He's been sick." Sick. The word hit me like a physical blow. My father, who'd always been the strongest man I knew, who'd never missed a day of work in his life, who'd seemed invincible through my entire childhood. "What kind of sick?" I demanded, my military training kicking in. When you get bad news in the Army, you ask for specifics, for tactical assessments, for actionable intelligence. Well, Jake jumped in, running his hand through his hair in a gesture I recognized as nervousness. "The doctors aren't really sure. It's been going on for about 6 months. He's been in and out of the hospital and the medical bills are astronomical," Tina added, a little too quickly. "I mean, we're doing everything we can, but... There was always a but with these people," I was beginning to remember. Laura put her hand on my arm, and I noticed her nails were perfectly manicured despite supposedly caring for a sick husband. "The important thing is that you're here now. James has been asking for you. He'll be so happy to see you." As we walked into the house, I noticed things that didn't add up. Fresh flowers in expensive vases. New furniture in the living room. Laura's designer handbag casually tossed on the counter. Jake's obviously new car in the driveway. For a family struggling with medical bills, they seemed to be doing pretty well for themselves. But it was the way they looked at each other when they thought I wasn't watching that really got my attention. The subtle nods, the raised eyebrows, the way conversations stopped when I entered a room. It reminded me of insurgents I'd dealt with overseas, people who were planning something they didn't want you to know about. My father was upstairs, sleeping. Laura insisted we let him rest, that he needed his strength. But as I climbed those familiar stairs to my childhood bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something much more dangerous than I'd ever faced in uniform. That first night, lying in my old bed surrounded by teenage memories and military medals, I stared at the ceiling and tried to process what I'd observed. Something was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. And every instinct I'd honed through years of military service was screaming at me to find out what it was. Little did I know that by morning, I'd stumble onto a conspiracy so cold-blooded, so calculating, that it would make every enemy I'd faced in combat look like saints by comparison. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you're subscribed, because what I discovered next will shock you to your core. The betrayal ran deeper than I could have imagined, and the stakes were higher than life itself. The next morning, I woke up at 0500 hours. Old habits die hard, and decided to check on Dad before anyone else was awake. Military life teaches you the value of reconnaissance, and I wanted to assess his condition without Laura's performance clouding my judgment. What I found broke my heart. My father, the man who'd carried me on his shoulders and taught me to be strong, looked like a shadow of himself. He'd lost at least 40 pounds, his skin had a grayish pallor, and he was connected to more machines than I could count. But his eyes were still sharp, still alert, still the same warm brown that had comforted me through every childhood crisis. "Nia," he whispered when he saw me, and his face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen since coming home. My soldier girl. I spent 2 hours with him that morning, and slowly, carefully, I began to piece together what was really happening. Dad had been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer 6 months ago. The treatments were experimental and expensive, but he had excellent insurance and significant savings. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. With proper care, he had a good chance of recovery. But here's what didn't make sense. Laura had been making decisions about his care. Laura had been managing his medications. Laura had been controlling who could visit and when. And according to Dad, Laura had been very concerned about making sure all his financial affairs were in order. "She's been such a help," Dad said, but there was something in his voice, a hesitation that made me lean closer. "I don't know what I'd do without her. She handles everything now, the bills, the insurance, even my medication schedule." Red flags were going up all over my mental radar. In the military, we call it operational security, OPSEC. You never let one person control all the intel, all the communications, all the access points. It creates vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. That afternoon, while Laura was at the grocery store and Jake and Tina were supposedly at work, I did what any good soldier does. I gathered intelligence. Dad's medical records were in a filing cabinet in the home office. Laura had been sloppy about locking it, probably because she never expected me to come home unannounced. What I found made my blood run cold. The insurance company had been sending letters for months, questioning some of the medical expenses being claimed. Treatments that Dad supposedly received, but had no memory of. Medications that didn't match his prescriptions. Bills for medical equipment that was nowhere to be found in the house. But that wasn't the worst part. Hidden behind the medical files, I found life insurance documents. Multiple policies, all recent, all with Dad as the insured and Laura as the primary beneficiary. The total value? $3.2 million. 3.2 million reasons for Laura to want my father dead. My hands were shaking as I photographed everything with my phone. This wasn't just medical fraud. This was attempted murder disguised as loving care. And Jake and Tina were in on it. I found text messages on a piece of paper Laura had left behind, probably notes from phone conversations. The doctor says 6 months if the treatment continues. We need to speed things up. Jake found a contact who can help with the medication situation. Tina confirmed the insurance will pay out immediately upon death certificate. Need to keep Nia away until it's over. I sat in that office chair, staring at evidence of a conspiracy to murder my father, and felt something inside me snap. Not break, snap. Like a rubber band stretched too far, like a wire pulled beyond its tensile strength. These people had welcomed me home with hugs and smiles while plotting to kill the man who'd raised me, loved me, and sent me care packages through 6 years of military service. They'd looked me in the eye and lied about medical bills while sitting on life insurance policies worth millions. They'd been slowly poisoning my father while convincing him they were helping him heal. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't just going to stop them. I wasn't just going to save my father. I was going to destroy them so completely, so methodically, that they'd wish they'd never heard the name Mitchell. But I had to be smart about it. These people had been planning this for months, maybe years. They had systems in place, lies prepared, alibis ready. If I went in guns blazing, they'd scatter like cockroaches when the lights come on, and my father would be dead before I could prove anything. No, this required military precision, intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and the kind of cold, calculated patience that turns a good soldier into a legendary one. That evening at dinner, I watched them with new eyes. Laura, cutting Dad's food and carefully measuring his medication while explaining how much she loved him. Jake, talking about his new job while secretly planning to inherit a fortune he'd never earned. Tina, playing the devoted daughter while counting the days until her payday. They thought they were so clever. They thought they had it all figured out. They had no idea they were about to go to war with someone who'd spent 6 years learning how to win battles against much more dangerous enemies than 3 greedy, small-town conspirators. After dinner, Laura announced that Dad needed his rest and ushered everyone out of his room. I kissed his forehead and told him I loved him, and I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, maybe even relief. Somewhere deep down, I think he knew something was wrong. He just didn't know who to trust. As I lay in bed that night, I began formulating my battle plan. First, I needed to document everything. Every conversation, every interaction, every suspicious behavior. Second, I needed allies, people with the expertise and authority to help me take these criminals down. Third, I needed to protect Dad while I built my case. And finally, I needed to be prepared for war. Because when cornered animals realize they're being hunted, they become desperate. And desperate people do desperate, dangerous things. What I discovered next would prove just how right I was about that last part. The conspiracy went deeper than I'd imagined, and the timeline was shorter than I'd feared. Subscribe now because you won't believe what Laura was planning to do within the next 48 hours. The next morning, I put my plan into action. Years of military training had taught me that successful operations require three things: good intelligence, reliable allies, and unshakable resolve. I had the resolve. My father's life depended on it. Now I needed the other two. My first stop was the local police station. I'd gone to high school with Officer Mike Chin, and I knew he'd grown up to be one of the good ones. When I walked into the station in my dress uniform, because yes, I was absolutely going to use every advantage I had, Mike's face lit up. "Nia Mitchell, I heard you were back in town. Staff sergeant now, right? That's incredible." After catching up for a few minutes, I got down to business. "Mike, I need your help. I think my stepmother is trying to kill my father." To his credit, Mike didn't laugh or dismiss me. Maybe it was the uniform, maybe it was the fact that he'd known me since we were kids, or maybe it was something in my voice that told him I was deadly serious. He leaned forward and said, "Tell me everything." I laid out what I'd discovered: the insurance policies, the suspicious medical bills, the text message notes, Dad's deteriorating condition despite supposedly receiving treatment. Mike listened without interrupting, taking notes and asking pointed questions that told me he was taking this seriously. This is really serious stuff, Nia. If you're right, we're talking about insurance fraud, medical fraud, and attempted murder. But I have to tell you, proving it is going to be incredibly difficult. These kinds of cases are complex, and the evidence you have right now is circumstantial. What do I need to make it stick? I asked. Mike thought for a moment. You need documentation of the actual poisoning, medical evidence that your father is being given substances that are harming him. You need proof that Laura is the one administering those substances. And you need to establish motive and opportunity, which the insurance policies help with, but we'd need more. What about the fraudulent medical claims? That's actually our best starting point, Mike said, pulling out a business card. I have a contact at the insurance fraud division. Detective Sarah Rodriguez. She's been working these kinds of cases for years, and she's good. Really good. If anyone can help you build a case that'll stick, it's her. I left the police station with a plan and an ally. Detective Rodriguez agreed to meet me that afternoon at a coffee shop outside of town, somewhere we wouldn't be seen by Laura or her accomplices. Sarah Rodriguez turned out to be exactly what I needed: smart, experienced, and absolutely ruthless when it came to insurance fraud. She was in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every scam in the book. "I've been investigating your stepmother for 2 months," she said after I'd shown her my evidence. "We got flagged by some suspicious claims, but we couldn't get close enough to gather solid proof. You might be exactly what we need to break this case wide open." 2 months. They'd been investigating Laura for 2 months, which meant the insurance company had been suspicious long before I'd come home. Laura was already on their radar. She just didn't know it yet. "What have you found so far?" I asked. Sarah opened a thick file folder. "Laura Mitchell has been very busy. Fraudulent medical claims totaling over $200,000. Equipment rentals for devices that were never delivered. Treatments at facilities that have no record of your father ever being there. She's been systematic about it, but she's also been greedy. The pattern is clear once you know what to look for. She spread out documents across the table: insurance claims, bank records, pharmacy receipts. It was like looking at a blueprint for murder disguised as medical care. But here's the thing that really caught our attention, Sarah continued, pulling out a separate set of papers. Laura has been purchasing medications online. Drugs that aren't prescribed by your father's doctors. Drugs that, in the right combinations, can mimic the symptoms of his cancer while actually making him sicker. My stomach dropped. She's been poisoning him. We think so. But proving it requires medical evidence, and getting that evidence means getting my father away from her long enough for proper testing, I finished. Sarah nodded. And that's where it gets tricky. Laura has medical power of attorney. She controls his care, his medications, his access to doctors. If we tip our hand too early, she could change tactics, move him somewhere we can't monitor, or... She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. If Laura realized she was being investigated, she might decide to accelerate her timeline. Instead of slowly poisoning my father over months, she might choose a faster, more direct approach. How long do we have? I asked. Based on the insurance policies and the progression of fraudulent claims, I'd say we have maybe a week before she makes her move. The life insurance companies require a waiting period after purchase, but the oldest policy just cleared that threshold last week. 1 week to save my father's life and put 3 murderers behind bars. In the military, we called that a compressed timeline, and it meant there was no room for mistakes. Over the next 3 days, I became an intelligence-gathering machine. I installed a small recording device in the kitchen where Laura prepared Dad's medications. I documented every visitor, every phone call, every time she left the house. I took pictures of every pill bottle, every medical document, every suspicious conversation. What I discovered made me sick to my stomach. Laura wasn't just poisoning my father, she was documenting his decline for the insurance company. Taking photos of him looking weak and sick, recording conversations where he talked about being in pain, creating a medical narrative that would support a claim that his death was inevitable and natural. Jake and Tina weren't just passive participants. Jake had been researching untraceable poisons and methods of accelerating terminal illness. Tina had been practicing forging Dad's signature and had even gone so far as to create fake medical directives that would prevent aggressive life-saving measures. They had thought of everything. Every angle, every contingency, every possible complication. They'd planned this murder with the thoroughness of a military operation and the coldness of professional assassins. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after I'd come home, I overheard the conversation that confirmed my worst fears. Laura was on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones to someone I couldn't identify. No, it has to be this weekend. Nia's getting suspicious, and if we wait much longer, she might figure out what's happening. The medication dose we discussed, make sure it's ready by Friday night. It needs to look natural, like his system just couldn't handle the cancer anymore. Friday night, less than 24 hours away. I immediately called Detective Rodriguez. They're moving tomorrow night. Whatever we're going to do, it has to be now. Are you sure? Sarah asked. I just heard Laura confirming the timeline. They're planning to kill him tomorrow night and make it look like he died from cancer. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Sarah said the words I'd been hoping to hear, then it's time to take them down. What happened next was like something out of a military thriller, except it was real, it was my life, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. If you think you know how this story ends, trust me you don't. Hit that subscribe button because the next part of this story involves courtroom drama, federal agents, and a confrontation so intense it still gives me chills thinking about it. Friday morning dawned gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. Today was the day. Either I saved my father's life and brought 3 murderers to justice, or I lost everything trying. Detective Rodriguez had spent the night coordinating with federal authorities, because insurance fraud across state lines automatically becomes a federal crime, and by 6 a.m., we had a plan that was both brilliant and terrifying in its complexity. First, we needed to get Dad to safety without alerting Laura. Second, we needed to catch her in the act of attempting to administer whatever lethal dose she'd prepared. Third, we needed to do it all without giving her a chance to destroy evidence or flee. The plan required military precision, perfect timing, and a little bit of luck. Fortunately, I'd spent 6 years learning how to make my own luck. At 7 a.m., I knocked on Laura's bedroom door. "Laura? I was thinking of taking Dad to his doctor's appointment this morning instead of you. You've been working so hard, and I'd love to spend some time with him." Through the door, I could hear the panic in her voice. "Oh, that's so sweet, honey, but I always take him. He's used to my routine, and I know exactly what the doctors need to hear about his condition." "I insist," I said, using the tone of voice that had made subordinates jump to attention for 6 years. "Consider it my gift to you, a morning off." When she opened the door, Laura looked like she hadn't slept. Her perfectly styled hair was messy, her makeup was smudged, and there was something desperate in her eyes that confirmed everything I suspected. "Nia, really, I appreciate the offer, but your father is very sick, and any change in routine could be harmful to him." "I think it's better if the appointment is at 10 a.m., I interrupted. "I'm taking him. End of discussion." The look that crossed Laura's face in that moment was pure hatred. For just a second, the mask slipped completely, and I saw the real person underneath, cold, calculating, and absolutely furious that I was disrupting her carefully laid plans. But she forced a smile and said, "Of course, if that's what you want. Just make sure you give him his morning medication before you leave. It's the blue pills, 2 of them, with breakfast." The blue pills. I'd been watching her give Dad those blue pills every morning for a week, and I'd noticed that they weren't on any of his legitimate prescriptions. Thanks to Detective Rodriguez's investigation, I now knew they were a cocktail of drugs designed to weaken his immune system and mimic the symptoms of advancing cancer. "Of course," I said. "I'll make sure he gets exactly what he needs." At 8:30 a.m., while Laura was in the shower, I helped Dad get dressed and ready for his appointment. He was weak, but he was alert, and when I told him we were going to see some different doctors who might be able to help him feel better, his eyes lit up with hope. "I've been feeling so strange, Nia," he whispered as I helped him to the car. "Like something's not right with my medications." I try to tell Laura, but she says it's just the cancer getting worse. "Dad," I said, looking directly into his eyes, "how much do you trust me?" "With my life," he said without hesitation. "Good. Because that might be exactly what I'm asking for." Instead of going to his regular doctor, I drove Dad straight to the emergency room at Regional Medical Center, where Detective Rodriguez was waiting with a team of specialists who'd been briefed on the situation. Within an hour, they'd run a full blood panel and confirmed what we'd suspected. Dad's system was full of drugs that had nothing to do with cancer treatment and everything to do with slowly killing him. Dr. Patricia Vance, the emergency room physician, was visibly angry as she reviewed the results. "Mr. Mitchell, someone has been systematically poisoning you. The levels of these substances in your blood are just below lethal, but they've been building up over time. Another few days of this, and..." She didn't need to finish. We all knew what another few days would have meant. While the medical team worked to flush the toxins from Dad's system, Detective Rodriguez and I put the second phase of our plan into motion. We needed Laura to incriminate herself, and we needed it on record. I called her from the hospital. "Laura, something terrible has happened. Dad collapsed at the doctor's office. They're saying his condition has taken a turn for the worse, and they need to run more tests. Can you bring his evening medications to the hospital? The doctors want to review everything he's been taking." I could practically hear her mind racing through the phone. If doctors examined those medications too closely, they'd discover what she'd been doing. But if she refused to bring them, it would look suspicious. "Of course," she said finally. "I'll be right there." Oh, and Laura? Bring Jake and Tina with you. Dad's asking for the whole family. 2 hours later, Laura, Jake, and Tina walked into Regional Medical Center carrying a bag full of medications, having no idea they were walking into a trap that had been 6 months in the making. Detective Rodriguez met them in the hospital lobby, along with 2 federal agents and Officer Mike Chin. The conversation was brief and to the point. Laura Mitchell, Jake Harrison, and Tina Harrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and elder abuse. The look on Laura's face was priceless. Pure shock, followed by rage, followed by the kind of panic that comes when you realize your entire carefully constructed plan has just crumbled around you. Jake tried to run. That was a mistake. You don't outrun federal agents in a hospital lobby, and you definitely don't outrun a staff sergeant who's been training for 6 years. I tackled him before he made it 10 feet, and the satisfaction of seeing him handcuffed on the ground was almost worth everything I'd been through. Tina immediately started crying and claiming she didn't know anything about any plan. That was also a mistake, because Detective Rodriguez had recordings of her discussing forged medical directives and researching untraceable poisons. But Laura looked straight at me as they put the handcuffs on her wrists, and she said something I'll never forget. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've done. James was going to die anyway. At least this way, the family would have benefited. Now you've destroyed everything for nothing. For nothing. She genuinely believed that murdering my father for insurance money was a reasonable business decision, and that I was the problem for interfering with it. As they led her away, Laura turned back one more time. This isn't over, Nia. You can't prove anything that will stick, and when I get out, I'll make sure you regret this. That's when Detective Rodriguez smiled and held up a small recording device. Actually, Mrs. Mitchell, you just confessed to conspiracy to commit murder in front of 3 law enforcement officers and a hospital full of witnesses. I'd say we can prove quite a lot. The look on Laura's face as she realized what she'd just done was the second most satisfying moment of my life. The first most satisfying moment came 3 hours later, when Dad opened his eyes in his hospital bed, looked at me, and said, I feel better than I have in months. What did those doctors do? They saved your life, Dad. And they caught the people who were trying to take it away. If you think that's where this story ends, you're wrong. The arrest was just the beginning. What happened in the courtroom over the next 6 months was a masterclass in justice, and the final confrontation between Laura and me was so intense that court reporters later said it was the most dramatic thing they'd ever witnessed. Make sure you're subscribed, because the courtroom drama that follows will have you on the edge of your seat. The legal battle that followed was like nothing I'd ever experienced, and remember, I'd been through military tribunals and disciplinary hearings where careers and lives hung in the balance. But this was different. This was personal, and the stakes were higher than anything I'd faced in uniform. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a woman with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to insurance fraud cases. She'd reviewed our evidence and told Detective Rodriguez that it was one of the most clear-cut cases of attempted murder she'd seen in 15 years of prosecution. But Laura had hired Marcus Blackwood, one of the most expensive defense attorneys in the state. Blackwood was known for getting wealthy criminals reduced sentences by attacking the credibility of witnesses and finding technical loopholes in the evidence-gathering process. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the arrests, and in those 3 weeks, I learned something important. Laura, Jake, and Tina weren't going down without a fight. Blackwood's strategy became clear during the first hearing. He was going to paint me as a traumatized veteran with PTSD who'd imagined a conspiracy that didn't exist. He was going to claim that Dad's illness was genuine, that Laura was a devoted wife trying to care for her dying husband, and that I'd returned from military service with psychological problems that made me paranoid and delusional. Your Honor, Blackwood said during his opening statement, my client is a grieving wife whose husband is dying of cancer. She's been caring for him around the clock, managing his medications, dealing with insurance companies, and trying to hold her family together during the most difficult time of their lives. Then her stepdaughter returns from military service, and instead of helping with this tragic situation, she concocts an elaborate conspiracy theory and has my client arrested on completely fabricated charges. It was a good strategy, I had to admit. If I hadn't had rock-solid evidence and federal investigators backing me up, it might have worked. But Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh was ready for him. "Your Honor," she responded, "the defendant systematically poisoned her husband over a period of 6 months, while filing fraudulent insurance claims totaling over $200,000. She purchased life insurance policies worth $3.2 million and was planning to collect on those policies by murdering the insured. This isn't a grieving wife. This is a calculating predator who saw her husband's illness as an opportunity for profit." The evidence phase of the trial lasted 4 days, and it was devastating for the defense. Detective Rodriguez testified about the fraudulent insurance claims, the fake medical bills, and the pattern of deception that stretched back almost a year. The prosecution introduced bank records showing Laura had been living well beyond her means and had significant debts that the insurance payout would have covered. Dr. Patricia Vance testified about the toxins found in Dad's blood and explained how the combination of drugs Laura had been giving him would have slowly killed him while masking the cause of death. The medical testimony was technical, but the message was clear. This was attempted murder by poisoning. The pharmacy records were perhaps the most damning evidence. Laura had been ordering drugs online from multiple sources, paying with cash and prepaid credit cards, and having them delivered to addresses other than the family home. The prosecution showed receipts for drugs that had no legitimate medical use except to cause the exact symptoms Dad had been experiencing. But the moment that really sealed the case came when they played the recordings I'd made. The court listened in absolute silence as Laura's voice filled the room. "No, it has to be this weekend. Nia's getting suspicious, and if we wait much longer, she might figure out what's happening. The medication dose we discussed, make sure it's ready by Friday night. It needs to look natural, like his system just couldn't handle the cancer anymore." You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. Even Blackwood looked stunned. Then came Jake and Tina's testimony, and this is where things got really interesting. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of life sentences, both Jake and Tina decided to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges. What they revealed was even worse than I'd imagined. Jake testified that Laura had been planning this for over 2 years, ever since Dad's first minor health scare. She'd been researching methods of inducing illness, studying insurance policies, and carefully documenting Dad's medical history to establish a pattern that would support a natural death claim. Tina's testimony was even more shocking. She revealed that Laura had approached them when they were both struggling financially, offering them each $500,000 from the insurance payout in exchange for their help. She'd presented it as a mercy killing, helping Dad avoid suffering while ensuring the family's financial security. She made it sound like we were doing something noble. Tina sobbed on the witness stand. She said Dad was going to die anyway, and this way his death would at least serve a purpose. She convinced us we were being compassionate. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source: Laura's first husband, Robert Harrison, Jake and Tina's biological father. Robert took the stand on day 3 of the trial and dropped a bombshell that nobody saw coming. "Laura tried to kill me too," he said quietly. 15 years ago, when we were getting divorced. I started getting sick, really sick, and the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. It was only after I moved out of the house that I started getting better. I always suspected, but I could never prove it. The prosecution had found Robert after Jake mentioned his father's mysterious illness during his cooperation interview. When they tracked him down and explained what Laura had been doing to my father, Robert immediately agreed to testify. "I divorced her because I thought she was trying to poison me," Robert continued. But I had no evidence, no proof. She convinced everyone, including my own children, that I was having a mental breakdown from the stress of our marriage failing. When I accused her of poisoning me, she used it to get full custody of Jake and Tina. The pattern was becoming clear. Laura wasn't just a grieving wife who'd made a desperate decision. She was a serial killer who'd been perfecting her methods for over a decade. Blackwood tried to discredit Robert's testimony, arguing that it was too old and too circumstantial to be relevant. But the damage was done. The jury now understood that this wasn't Laura's first attempt at murder by poisoning. On day 4, it was my turn to testify. I'd been dreading this moment because I knew Blackwood was going to try to tear me apart. He was going to attack my military service, my mental health, my motivations for investigating my own family. He was going to try to make me look like an unstable veteran who'd fabricated a conspiracy to get attention. But I'd spent 6 years learning how to handle hostile interrogations and high-pressure situations. I was ready for him. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh started with friendly questions, walking me through my timeline of discovering the evidence, my decision to involve law enforcement, and my efforts to protect my father. I spoke clearly and calmly, sticking to facts and avoiding emotional reactions. Then Blackwood stood up, and I could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. He thought he was about to destroy me. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," he began, emphasizing my rank like it was somehow suspicious. "You've been in combat situations overseas, haven't you?" "Yes, sir." "And in those combat situations, you've seen violence, death, and betrayal, correct?" "Yes, sir." "Would you say those experiences might have made you hypervigilant? Perhaps prone to seeing threats where none exist?" I looked directly at him and said, "Sir, my military experience taught me to recognize real threats and distinguish them from imaginary ones. The threat to my father was very real, as evidenced by the toxins found in his blood and the fraudulent insurance claims filed by the defendant." Blackwood tried a different approach. "Isn't it true that you and your stepmother never got along? That you resented her marriage to your father?" "Sir, my personal feelings about the defendant are irrelevant to the evidence of attempted murder and insurance fraud." "You broke into your stepmother's private files, didn't you?" "Without a warrant, without permission. I discovered evidence of a crime in my father's house, where I was a legal resident during my leave. I immediately turned that evidence over to law enforcement, who obtained proper warrants for further investigation." For 20 minutes, Blackwood tried to shake me, to make me angry, to get me to say something that would support his narrative of an unstable veteran with a vendetta. But I'd been trained for this. In the military, you learn to stay calm under pressure, to stick to facts, and to never let emotions compromise your mission. Finally, Blackwood made the mistake that destroyed his entire defense strategy. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell, isn't it possible that you simply misunderstood what you saw? That you interpreted innocent actions as sinister because of your own psychological trauma from combat?" That's when I stood up, proper military posture, shoulders back, voice clear and strong, and delivered the response that court reporters later said was the turning point of the entire trial. "Sir, with respect, there is no misunderstanding or misinterpretation involved when toxicology reports show my father was being systematically poisoned. There is no psychological trauma that could cause me to fabricate fraudulent insurance claims totaling over $200,000. There is no combat-related paranoia that could make me imagine life insurance policies worth $3.2 million. And there is no mental health condition that could cause me to hallucinate recordings of the defendant planning my father's murder for this weekend. The evidence speaks for itself, sir. My stepmother tried to kill my father for money, and she almost succeeded. The only thing my military training contributed to this case was the ability to recognize a threat, gather intelligence, and take decisive action to neutralize that threat before it could cause irreparable harm." The courtroom was absolutely silent when I finished. Even Blackwood looked stunned. In trying to attack my credibility, he'd given me the perfect opportunity to lay out the entire case in one devastating response. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh later told me it was the most effective witness testimony she'd seen in 20 years of prosecution. But the real fireworks came during cross-examination, when Laura herself took the stand in her own defense. What happened next was the most intense courtroom confrontation I've ever witnessed, and I was right in the middle of it. Laura thought she could manipulate the jury the same way she'd manipulated everyone else for years. She was wrong. Dead wrong. If you're not subscribed yet, you need to be, because what comes next will leave you speechless. Laura taking the stand was a surprise to everyone, including her own attorney. Blackwood had advised against it, but Laura insisted she could convince the jury that she was innocent. She'd spent years manipulating people, and she genuinely believed she could charm her way out of attempted murder charges. It was the biggest mistake she could have made. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh began the cross-examination with deceptive gentleness, asking Laura about her marriage to my father, her relationship with Jake and Tina, and her role in managing Dad's medical care. Laura answered confidently, portraying herself as a devoted wife overwhelmed by her husband's illness, but determined to care for him no matter what. Mrs. Mitchell, Walsh said, "You've heard testimony that your husband was found to have significant levels of unauthorized medications in his blood. Can you explain how those substances got there?" "I have no idea," Laura replied smoothly. "James takes many medications for his cancer." Perhaps there was some kind of interaction, or maybe the hospital made an error in their testing. But these weren't cancer medications, Mrs. Mitchell. According to Dr. Vance's testimony, these were substances that would actually worsen your husband's condition while mimicking cancer symptoms. Substances that aren't available through legitimate medical channels. Laura's composure flickered for just a moment. "I don't know anything about that. I only gave James the medications prescribed by his doctors." Walsh moved to the evidence table and picked up a folder. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm showing you Exhibit 47, pharmacy records showing online purchases of these exact substances, paid for with prepaid credit cards registered to addresses associated with you. Can you explain these purchases?" "I've never seen those records before," Laura said, but her voice was less confident now. "And Exhibit 48, bank records showing cash withdrawals from your personal account that correspond exactly to the amounts of these online purchases. Are you claiming someone else made these withdrawals?" Those withdrawals were for household expenses. I don't keep detailed records of every cash purchase." Walsh smiled, and I knew Laura was walking into a trap. "Mrs. Mitchell, let's talk about life insurance. How many policies did you purchase on your husband's life in the past 18 months? We discuss life insurance as part of our financial planning. Given James's illness, it seemed prudent. For policies, Mrs. Mitchell. For separate policies from 4 different companies, totaling $3.2 million, all purchased after your husband's cancer diagnosis. That's not financial planning, that's betting on your husband's death." Laura was starting to sweat now. James agreed to those policies. He wanted to make sure the family was provided for. Did he agree to them, Mrs. Mitchell? "Because I have here a handwriting analysis of the applications, and according to our expert, your husband's signatures were forged on 3 of the 4 policies." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Even Blackwood looked shocked. This was evidence that hadn't been presented during the prosecution's case, and Laura had just walked right into it. "That's impossible," Laura stammered. "James signed those himself. I was there." Walsh moved closer to the witness stand. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you familiar with the phone number 555-0147? I don't know. I get calls from many numbers. That's the number for Riverside Pharmacy, an online medication supplier that doesn't require prescriptions. According to their records, someone using your name called that number 17 times in the past 6 months, ordering the exact substances found in your husband's blood. Would you like to hear a recording of one of those calls?" Laura went pale. "I want to speak to my attorney." "You can speak to your attorney during recess, Mrs. Mitchell. But right now you're under oath, and I'm asking you to explain these phone calls." "I never called any pharmacy." Walsh nodded to the court clerk, who activated the courtroom's audio system. Laura's voice filled the room, clear as day. Yes, I need to place another order for the items we discussed. The patient's condition is progressing, and we need to maintain the current dosage schedule. Can you have them delivered to the usual address? The look on Laura's face was pure horror. She hadn't known the pharmacy recorded their calls, and now her own voice was condemning her in front of 12 jurors. Mrs. Mitchell, Walsh continued relentlessly, in this recording, you're ordering medications to slowly kill your husband while making it look like cancer progression. Do you still maintain your innocence? Laura looked around the courtroom desperately, her eyes finally landing on me. For a moment, I saw something that might have been remorse, or maybe just panic at being caught. Then she did something that shocked everyone in the room. She pointed directly at me and screamed, "This is all her fault. Nia came home and ruined everything. James was going to die anyway. The cancer was real. At least this way, the family would have been taken care of. She destroyed everything for nothing." The courtroom exploded. Blackwood was on his feet objecting, the judge was pounding his gavel, and the jury was staring at Laura in complete shock. She had just confessed to attempted murder in front of everyone. But she wasn't done. "You think you're so righteous, Nia?" Laura shouted, ignoring the judge's orders to be quiet. "You have no idea what it's like to be married to a man who never forgot his precious first wife. You have no idea what it's like to raise children who aren't biologically yours while watching him pour all his love and attention into his real daughter who's off playing soldier." The hatred in her voice was absolutely poisonous. Years of resentment were pouring out of her, and I finally understood what had driven her to attempted murder. James was never going to change his will to include Jake and Tina equally. They were always going to be second-class children in his eyes. The only way they were ever going to get what they deserved was if he died while I was still his wife and beneficiary. "Mrs. Mitchell," the judge was shouting now, "you will stop speaking immediately or I will hold you in contempt." But Laura was beyond caring about contempt charges. She turned to me one final time and said the words that still haunt me, "I should have killed you instead." Then James would have had no one else to love, and everything would have worked out perfectly. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, staring at Laura in complete disbelief. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh looked at the jury and said quietly, "Your Honor, I believe the defendant has just provided her own closing argument." The judge declared a recess, and as the bailiffs led Laura away, she was ranting about how unfair it all was and how I had ruined her life. I sat in that courtroom and processed what I'd just witnessed. This woman hadn't just tried to kill my father for money. She'd tried to kill him because she was jealous of the love he'd shown me. She'd been planning to murder the man who'd raised me, loved me, and supported my military career because she couldn't stand that he'd never loved her the way he'd loved my mother. It was sick, twisted, and absolutely terrifying in its pettiness. During the recess, Detective Rodriguez came up to me. "In 15 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like that. She just confessed to attempted murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and threatening to commit murder. Her own attorney looks like he wants to disappear. Is it over?" I asked. "Oh, it's over. The jury will deliberate for maybe an hour, just to make it look official. But after that outburst, she's going away for life." Detective Rodriguez was right. The jury returned after 53 minutes with guilty verdicts on all charges: attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, elder abuse, and making terroristic threats. Jake and Tina, who had cooperated with the prosecution, received sentences of 15 and 12 years respectively. They would be middle-aged when they got out, with criminal records that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But Laura received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As they led her away in handcuffs for the final time, she looked at me one last time. There was no remorse in her eyes, no regret for what she'd tried to do. There was only hatred and the bitter anger of someone who'd been caught. "This isn't justice," she said. "This is revenge." I looked right back at her and said, "No, Laura. This is consequences." You might think that's where this story ends, but you'd be wrong. The aftermath of the trial brought revelations that were even more shocking than anything we discovered during the investigation. And my father's recovery? Well, that's a story that will restore your faith in the power of family, love, and second chances. Stay with me, because the final chapter of this story will leave you with hope and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes justice really does prevail. 6 months after Laura's sentencing, I was sitting in Dad's newly renovated kitchen, watching him cook breakfast for the first time in over a year. The man who'd been barely clinging to life when I came home was now healthy, strong, and had gained back all the weight he'd lost during Laura's systematic poisoning. The doctors called it miraculous. I called it what happens when you stop being slowly murdered by someone you trust. But Dad's physical recovery was only part of the story. The emotional and psychological healing took much longer, and in some ways, it's still ongoing. "I keep thinking about how I trusted her," Dad said one morning as we sat on the porch with our coffee. "How I let her control my medications, my medical care, my entire life. How did I become so blind to what was happening to me?" It was a conversation we'd had many times since the trial, and my answer was always the same. "Dad, you weren't blind. You were being systematically poisoned by someone who'd spent years learning how to manipulate you. The drugs she was giving you affected your thinking, your judgment, your ability to recognize what was happening. You weren't weak or stupid. You were a victim of a very sophisticated crime." But the hardest part for Dad wasn't the physical effects of the poisoning. It was the betrayal. He'd loved Laura, trusted her completely, and believed she was caring for him during the most vulnerable time of his life. Learning that she'd been slowly killing him while pretending to love him had shattered something deep inside him. "How do I ever trust anyone again?" he asked me once. "How do I know that someone isn't just waiting for me to get sick so they can finish what Laura started?" It was a question I couldn't answer easily, because I was struggling with the same issues. Laura's betrayal had damaged more than just Dad's health. It had damaged our ability to trust, to feel safe in our own home, to believe that family meant protection rather than danger. But slowly, with the help of counseling and time, we both began to heal. The financial aftermath was complicated, but ultimately satisfying. The insurance companies not only denied all of Laura's fraudulent claims, but also launched their own investigation that uncovered additional fraud dating back years. Laura had been running insurance scams long before she decided to kill Dad, and the total amount of her fraudulent activities exceeded $500,000. Dad's legitimate medical expenses were covered by his real insurance, and his recovery was so complete that his doctors declared him to be in remission. The experimental treatments he'd been receiving before Laura started poisoning him had actually been working. She'd just been undermining them with her deadly cocktail of unauthorized drugs. The life insurance policies Laura had purchased were voided due to fraud, but Dad kept one legitimate policy he'd had for years, with me as the beneficiary, the way it had always been. But perhaps the most unexpected part of the aftermath came from an investigation that Detective Rodriguez launched after the trial. She'd been bothered by Robert Harrison's testimony about his own suspected poisoning, and she decided to dig deeper into Laura's past. What she found was horrifying. Laura had been married once before Robert, to a man named David Chin who died suddenly of a heart attack at age 34. At the time, his death had been ruled natural, but when Detective Rodriguez had his body exhumed and tested, they found traces of the same toxins Laura had been using on Dad. Laura hadn't just been a would-be murderer, she'd been a serial killer who'd successfully murdered her first husband and gotten away with it for over 20 years. "We may never know how many people she killed or tried to kill," Detective Rodriguez told me. "But based on what we've found, your father wasn't her first victim. He was just the first one who had someone willing to fight for his life." The revelation that Laura was a serial killer rather than just a greedy stepmother somehow made everything worse and better at the same time. Worse because it meant the evil in our house had been even deeper than we'd realized. Better because it confirmed that everything I'd done to stop her had been absolutely necessary. Dad took the news about David Chen's murder harder than I'd expected. "That means Jake and Tina grew up with a mother who'd murdered their father," he said quietly. "No wonder they were so easily convinced to help her. They'd been living with a killer their entire lives." It was true, and it helped explain how Jake and Tina had been drawn into Laura's conspiracy. They'd been raised by a woman who viewed murder as a reasonable solution to financial problems. In their twisted worldview, helping to kill Dad wasn't evil, it was just business. Jake and Tina both wrote letters to Dad from prison, apologizing for their roles in Laura's plan and expressing genuine remorse for what they'd done. Dad, being the forgiving man he is, actually wrote back to them. Not to excuse their actions, but to offer them the possibility of redemption if they could find a way to become better people. "They're still my stepchildren," he explained to me. "Laura poisoned their minds the same way she poisoned my body. Maybe there's a chance for them to recover too." I wasn't as forgiving as Dad, but I respected his decision. Jake and Tina had made their choices, and they were facing the consequences. Whether they emerged from prison as better people or not wasn't my responsibility. My responsibility was to Dad, to our family, and to making sure nothing like this ever happened again. 1 year after Laura's sentencing, I made a decision that changed the course of my life. I left the army. It wasn't an easy choice. The military had been my home, my identity, my purpose for 6 years. But watching my father almost die while I was serving overseas had taught me something important. Family isn't just about blood or duty or obligation. It's about being present for the people you love when they need you most. Dad tried to talk me out of it. "Nia, you're a career soldier. You're meant for bigger things than taking care of your old man." But I'd already made up my mind. "Dad, I've spent 6 years serving my country. Now I want to spend some time serving my family." I used my military savings and Dad's financial support to start a private investigation company specializing in elder abuse and insurance fraud. The idea came from Detective Rodriguez, who pointed out that there were probably hundreds of Laura Mitchells out there, preying on vulnerable older adults while their families remained unaware of the danger. "You have the investigative skills, the military training, and the personal experience to spot these predators," she told me. "You could save a lot of lives." Mitchell Protective Services opened 18 months after the trial, and within the first year, we'd investigated 12 cases of suspected elder abuse. 7 of those cases resulted in criminal charges, and 5 resulted in convictions. We saved 4 lives that we know of, and probably prevented dozens of other attempted murders. The work was emotionally difficult. Every case reminded me of what had almost happened to Dad, but it was also incredibly rewarding. There's nothing quite like the feeling of catching a predator in the act and knowing you've prevented another family from going through what we'd experienced. Dad became my unofficial partner in the business. His experience as a victim gave him insights that I couldn't have developed on my own, and his natural compassion helped comfort other families who were dealing with betrayal and attempted murder. "I know what it feels like to be slowly poisoned by someone you trust," he would tell them. "But I also know that recovery is possible, that trust can be rebuilt, and that justice can prevail if you're willing to fight for it." Together, we developed a system for identifying the warning signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation. We created educational materials for families and healthcare providers. We testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger laws protecting vulnerable adults. But perhaps most importantly, we helped other families avoid the nightmare we'd lived through. 3 years after Laura's conviction, I got a call that brought everything full circle. It was from a young woman named Sarah, whose stepfather had been acting strangely since her mother's death. He'd remarried quickly to a woman who seemed overly interested in his finances, and he'd been getting sicker despite receiving medical treatment. The parallels to our own story were so exact that I felt chills listening to Sarah's description of her stepfather's new wife. She insists on managing all his medications, Sarah told me. She won't let anyone else take him to doctor's appointments, and she's been asking a lot of questions about his life insurance. But everyone thinks I'm just being paranoid because I don't like her. Sarah, I said, you're not being paranoid. You're being protective. And that might save your stepfather's life. The investigation that followed revealed that Sarah's stepmother was indeed poisoning her husband while filing fraudulent insurance claims. We caught her before she could complete her murder plan, and another family was spared the trauma we'd endured. As I watched Sarah's stepmother being led away in handcuffs, I thought about the chain of events that had brought me to that moment. Laura's attempt to murder my father had been the worst experience of my life, but it had also led me to a purpose I never could have imagined. I was no longer Staff Sergeant Nia Mitchell, soldier. I was Nia Mitchell, protector of families, investigator of elder abuse, and someone who understood that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign battlefields. They're fought in hospital rooms and courtrooms and family homes where evil disguises itself as love. As I finish telling you this story, I want you to understand something important. This isn't just about one family's experience with betrayal and attempted murder. This is about recognizing the warning signs of elder abuse, about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, and about never giving up on the people you love. If you have elderly relatives or family members who are vulnerable to exploitation, please pay attention to who has access to their medications, their finances, and their medical care. Ask questions. Stay involved. Trust your gut if something doesn't feel right. Because somewhere out there, there's another Laura Mitchell looking for her next victim. And the only thing standing between her and your family might be your willingness to ask the hard questions and fight for the truth. Dad is doing great, by the way. 5 years after Laura's arrest, he's healthier than he's been in decades. He's dating a wonderful woman named Carol, who's a retired nurse and absolutely nothing like Laura. Carol encourages his independence, supports his relationship with me, and has never once asked about his life insurance policies. We take things slowly in our family now. We pay attention to red flags. We trust, but we verify. And we never, ever let one person control all the access to someone we love. Jake was released from prison last year after serving 8 years of his 15-year sentence. He wrote to Dad asking for forgiveness and a chance to rebuild their relationship. Dad agreed to meet with him, and they're slowly working towards some kind of reconciliation. Jake seems genuinely remorseful and has been attending therapy to understand how he became involved in his mother's murderous schemes. Tina is still in prison and has cut off all contact with our family. According to her correspondence with prison officials, she still believes she was wrongfully convicted and that Laura was justified in her actions. Some people, it seems, are beyond redemption. Laura died in prison 3 years ago. Heart attack, the official report said. Natural causes. I felt nothing when I heard the news. No satisfaction, no relief, no sadness. She'd become irrelevant to my life, a problem that had been solved and filed away. Mitchell Protective Services has now investigated over 50 cases of elder abuse and financial exploitation. We've prevented dozens of murders, recovered millions of dollars in stolen assets, and helped hundreds of families recognize and escape from dangerous situations. But more than that, we've proven that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's using your pain to prevent others from experiencing the same trauma. Every case we solve, every predator we catch, every family we save is a victory not just for justice, but for love, trust, and the belief that families should protect each other rather than prey on each other. If this story has taught you anything, I hope it's taught you to pay attention to the warning signs, to trust your instincts, and to never underestimate the power of one person who's willing to fight for what's right. Because in the end, that's all it took to save my father's life and bring 3 murderers to justice. One soldier who came home at the right time, paid attention to the wrong details, and refused to let evil disguise itself as love. Thank you for listening to my story. If it's helped even one person recognize a dangerous situation or inspired someone to fight for a family member who can't fight for themselves, then sharing it was worth every difficult memory I had to relive. Take care of each other out there. And remember, sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought not with weapons, but with courage, determination, and an unshakable commitment to protecting the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, redemption, and the triumph of good over evil. Because there are more stories to tell, more battles to fight, and more families to protect. Until next time, this is Nia Mitchell reminding you. Trust your instincts, protect your family, and never give up on justice.